Are you looking to get ready, be prepared, and transform your financial future? Then you've come to the right place. This is the Get Ready Money podcast with Tony Stewart, where Tony has insightful conversations with financial experts who are changing the way we think about money. Catch up on the latest financial trends and hear practical advice from Tony and his expert guests so you can build healthy habits that work. Be empowered with tips for implementing small changes that can have a big impact on your financial future. So sit back and get ready to hear from today's guest.
Welcome to the Get Ready Money podcast, changing the way we think about money. I'm pleased to be joined today by Karl Swanepoel. Karl is the founder and CEO of Revolancer. In this episode, we'll be discussing Karl's thoughts on how we change the way we think about money and how we give freedom back to freelancers. Karl, welcome to the Get Ready Money podcast.
Well, thanks for having me, Tony. It's my pleasure.
Yeah, we'll look forward to learning more about you and the company. So to get started, tell us a little bit about who you are. Can you share with us, what is your origin story?
Sure. Well, I decided when I was quite young that I wanted to work for myself and create my own company, create my own journey. And I started that through freelancing, which then actually led to getting a good understanding of the freelancing space, seeing what's working well, more importantly, what could be going better. And that then eventually led me to start Revolancer to try and solve those issues that I experienced early on. But, for a very long time, so since I was 13, I have always been looking for various different ways to make money online. Some worked, most didn't. But everything has led to kind of where I am today. I picked up some what I consider to be interesting lessons along the way, and hopefully someone finds them useful.
Well, fantastic. So, I know you had a lot of success early on. Is there any advice you can give to younger people in the audience, if they're thinking, hey, I'm too young to do this?
Well, I don't know if I'm the best person to say because, when I started my first business, I used PayPal, and PayPal kept locking my accounts because I couldn't prove that I was older than 18. I was 15 at the time. So I don't know, but I suppose the best thing I can say is kind of what I did is that I'm not encouraging you to break PayPal or anyone else's rules, but what I am encouraging you to do is to just try and just keep going and try what you can, get scrappy, and it all pays off in the end. Like the kind of things you learn, even if you had certain roadblocks, the learnings are absolutely invaluable, and I certainly wouldn't be where I am today if it weren't for that kind of approach early on.
Fantastic. That's great advice. And I think, even if you're older, that applies, to keep trying, to not give up and, look for different solutions. And to my audience out there, please don't try to break PayPal, or at least say you heard it here. You can't quote us on that. So, Karl, let's talk a little bit about the company. How is Revolancer giving freedom back to freelancers?
Well, a lot of the way that the industry towards freelancers is currently structured and has been for a very long time is actually, if you think about it, quite bizarre. So other kind of large freelancing platforms, their approach essentially is to give clients the best possible deal, and the way that they do that is I think arguably at the expense of freelancers. So large freelancing platforms, they make money through commission fees, which they charge primarily to the freelancer in most cases. So it can be the case that they charge 20% of each transaction to the freelancer, and then 5% to the client on top as well, which results in just under 25% in a commission. And in order to enforce that, because if you've been working with a client, even for the first time, but especially if you've been working with a client a couple of times, how willing are you going to be for, an extended period of time to keep paying such a large chunk of your earnings to the platform? Which is very understandable. And because of that, they actually disrupt your workflow quite seriously, by stopping you from emailing clients, stopping you from video calling or calling clients in any way, which then has a knock-on effect, right? Where clients are now not really able to communicate properly with these freelancers that they hire, which ultimately results in in less value for everyone involved, and certainly not an ideal kind of solution. And you can't integrate these freelancers into your team. So this is something that's very, the way that things have been done for the past 20 years with these large freelancing platforms. And we're looking to change that, permanently, and for the better. And the way we do that is, well, we don't charge commission fees, and we allow freelancers and clients to work in a way that is compatible with, the modern way of doing remote work, such as video calling. I think is a pretty essential part now. And ultimately our brand is very pro freelancer, because ultimately our philosophy is that if we can be very pro freelancer and attract the best talent, then ultimately that's actually providing the best platform and best experience to the clients as well. So that's where we feel we have to start, and and that gives the optimal result.
Well, fantastic. It sounds exciting. And I know I've worked with some of these platforms too, and it can be very disruptive when you're in the middle of a project or the project scope expands. So, of course, the question is, how are you compensated as a company?
Well, through various other ways, such as, for example, subscription fees for access to certain, more kind of desirable features. If you look at a company like Fiverr, for example, they charge 20% commission to the freelancer and 5% to the client on top of the transaction. So that works out to, I think, 23.8% or so on the entire transaction. If they just charged every one of their sort of active freelancers $5 a month, they would generate the same revenue. And wouldn't that be better for everyone? I certainly think so. So that's kind of more along the lines of what we are looking to build, rather than taking massive cuts of people's earnings, and therefore then, kind of being forced to ban them from video calling or communicating externally in any way.
Well, that's fantastic. And I think, one of the things, where it relates to the financial literacy conversation is in the passive income, is because there's only two ways to increase your financial position, is to either reduce your expenses and increase your income. And I think people sometimes overlook the expenses that go into freelance work. Is it sounds great, you're going to get paid X dollars per hour or X dollars per project. And, it's easy to overlook these details. And I love the simplicity of a subscription model, because somebody knows what their expenses are going to be. So I think it's a great model. And I think it's interesting for people who are thinking about picking up additional work, is to be mindful of those commissions. Like if you drive an Uber, or as you say, if you take work through a Fiverr or whatever, that those fees will eat up the money that you earn. So that's fantastic. One of the other things, you talk about, your company talks about, is community. Why is it important to unlock creativity through community?
Well, because I think, ultimately the reasons, the reason, probably the main reason, frankly, why humans have been able to accomplish what we have is through collaboration. Other sort of animals don't collaborate in the same way that we do. And our sort of, ability and willingness to collaborate with each other has meant that we, have created a civilized kind of society, and have accomplished things, far and beyond what perhaps any other species on this planet has been able to. And I think the same thing extends here, right? Freelancers are oftentimes, in most cases, very creative and very talented people. But if you have people working together, that is compounded, massively, massively compounded. And if you sort of just isolate people, then you don't get that same effect. So I think, for freelancers to really achieve their true potential, and for the clients of freelancers to, also absolutely get that potential out of them, there needs to be a sense of community and collaboration.
Well, fantastic. And so is that one of the services your company provides, is, sort of an entree into freelancing for people who are new to freelancing?
Yes, absolutely it is. That's something that's very, important to me personally, but also to the company as a whole. I mean, what's really quite surprising is recently a kind of a survey came out that more than 70% of Gen Z want to go into freelancing as opposed to a traditional 9 to 5 job. And even, today there are 1.5 billion freelancers in the world, which is a third of global workforce. And McKinsey, the very prevalent consulting firm, predicts that by 2027, more than half of the US workforce will be freelancers. So, the world is very much moving in the direction of this way of work. But unfortunately, right now, there aren't that many solutions to really help people, adapt to that way of working. And that's something that's very important to us, and something where, I'm very proud of the fact that we've helped many freelancers kind of get started, perhaps in a way that is easier than it would have otherwise been, if Revolancer wasn't around.
Well, that's fantastic. Yeah. And as I think through it, is, it is a part of, it definitely relates to financial literacy, is because freelancers are even more responsible for their personal finances, because they have to have their own insurance. They have to take care of their own retirement plan, or, as you may say, retirement scheme. Is that correct?
Yeah, for sure.
So, there are those things. And so I think it's important for people to be thinking about what resources they need if they look at this different way of earning income, which is a great way to earn income. And as from your personal story, it gave you freedom to do things. And I think that's why so many people are interested in, one of the reasons people are interested in freelancing. So that's fantastic. So, Karl, let's get into the Get Ready Money questions. So the first one is, what basic money concept do you wish people knew?
Well, this is actually quite an interesting one. So when I started Revolancer, I was in my last year of university. So, I was a student who didn't have a lot of money lying around, like most students, don't. And I entered a sort of a startup competition that my university was hosting, where there was a prize to start your company that was probably about 15,000 USD or so, right? And I remember kind of, in my current position, viewing that as an enormous amount of money, and and it is certainly not a small amount of money. But one thing that I then learned, kind of, going from that to then raising kind of, much, much larger amounts of funding from investors, is that, the way people view money, it's very relative to their position, right? So, in the same way that an angel investor might think about investing $10,000, that might be the same as somebody else, the same kind of weight of decision as somebody else deciding to go to a fancy restaurant for dinner and maybe spending $200 or $300 or something. And it might be the same as somebody, it could go even lower, it could go even higher, right? And this is something that I kind of realized, because I used to think of money in a very kind of linear way, but in reality, it's very much relative. So, if you speak to somebody who earns a lot more, or certainly if you're sort of speaking to other companies in B2B sales, for example, the amounts are very much relative to what that entity has access to. And of course, also the value that they kind of can potentially get out of it. So that's something which, I think I learned by kind of doing what I do, and something which certainly, was some level of surprise to me, but something that I'm glad I learned.
Yeah, well, no, that's an awesome lesson for people, because I think, sometimes people think, well, I can't do that because I don't have enough money right now, or that's not me. But I think it's more about the principles. And that's what you're saying is, if you're smaller, you're still making decisions about your investment portfolio. Now, maybe if you're a Goldman Sachs, you're making multi-billion-dollar decisions, but you're still making some of the same basic decisions. Not likening most of us to Goldman Sachs, but I think there's principles. You need to save more money than you spend. And those principles apply, no matter what, maybe physics laws of financial literacy. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, fantastic. So the next one is, what is one simple thing you can do each year to set yourself up for financial success?
Well, I think, and I absolutely can't take credit from this. This is from, I read the book Rich Dad Poor Dad by Robert Kiyosaki many, many years ago, probably easily 10 years ago or so now. And one thing from that book especially really stuck in my mind, which is sort of thinking about everything as either an asset or a liability, and then being quite frugal about your liabilities and investing in your assets and sort of building that up. And an asset is anything that either, holds or ideally, kind of makes you money, but not something that loses you money. Like that's a liability. And an example there is, like what about a car? Well, I think a car is in most cases a liability. So perhaps then you might want to think about not buying, a Ferrari or whatever fancy car you might want, until perhaps you can afford it and it's just not that big of a decision anymore. But perhaps in the meantime, sort of going for something that does the same job of getting you to A and B, from A to B. It's going to depreciate in value quite a lot. You're going to have to spend money on fuel, maintenance, storage, all kinds of stuff. And kind of viewing that as a liability, whereas, for example, an investment, in a business or something like that can be an asset, or perhaps even buying property. Although property you can look at it either way, but perhaps buying a rental property or something like that can be an asset. So just really looking through that lens at everything you do, I think can be very helpful, and something that perhaps most people don't do. And that's not, I'm not saying that to that, don't take it to the kind of nth degree, but just thinking in that way can certainly help you improve your financial situation.
Yeah, I think that's excellent advice, because it gets to efficiency. It gets to a little bit about what you were talking about earlier with the perspective, and it also gets to what we were talking about earlier about Revolancer and the expenses that you're paying, is to be efficient with what you're doing and thinking about what is its impact to your flow. And so that's great advice. So what is one habit that people can change when it comes to their money?
Well, one thing that I have kind of done from the beginning, I don't know why, but something that now I kind of understand more, and I'm happy that I do things that way, is kind of I will be very frugal with most things. but then things that I really care about, I splurge on. So I think like most people will to some degree splurge on a lot of different things. So perhaps they buy fancy clothing. Perhaps they kind of maybe push it with everything to the maximum of what they can afford. Whereas I have always had this kind of perspective of, well, clothing, for example, I really, I see that very much as a utility. I'm not really interested in designer brands or anything like that. So, I buy the cheapest possible stuff, and the same thing is true with a lot of other stuff, like, for example, food. I try to eat relatively healthily, but still, I don't sort of go eating out at extremely fancy restaurants all the time and this kind of thing. And that then means that I have more money to spend on things that I really care about and sort of bring me joy. And again, I don't think that that's something to take to the nth degree. But again, I think that's something where, if you're thinking like, oh, I wish I could afford to go on holiday, or I wish I could afford this or that, then perhaps one way to make that happen is to cut your level of expense on things that frankly don't really matter to you, so that you can put a higher level of expense into things that do matter to you, or sort of save that additional money so that somewhere down the line, you're in a position to buy a property, or do whatever you want with it, but not sort of just spending as much as you can on something, but instead maybe looking at saving money as much as possible.
Yeah, that's great. And it's in line with, what we've been talking about is, to be efficient with your money, to think about each purchase, and maybe that's the lesson from Rich Dad, Poor Dad, is to be mindful about where you're spending your money. So that's a great habit for people to, just to be mindful of that and to avoid lifestyle creep. Because it's easy, you get more money and it's like, oh, maybe I'll buy that new car. Like you were talking about, maybe getting a Ferrari, but is that the right move overall? And how will that impact you? So that's wonderful advice. So, the next question is, what money myth are you trying to break?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. I think one thing is people typically believe in the just world hypothesis, I believe it's called, right? So people think that those who work harder or have more are deserving of, having more, right? And that is just not how the world works. Somebody who's washing dishes in a restaurant, working 10-12 hour shifts or something, is arguably working harder than a lot of people who are making many multiples of their salary. And I think that's something to really consider, right? That the way the world works, those who have more don't necessarily deserve it. I mean, I have all kinds of issues with this concept of deserving or not deserving anyway, but I think the lesson there is that if you want to get more, yes, you need to work hard, fine, but it's more important that you work smart. So choose what it is you do, who you work with, what kind of value of services you can provide, how indispensable can you be, and then ultimately that way you can achieve much more.
That's fantastic. And that's good advice. And I think that's something people struggle with too, is finding the value for their pay. I know in the US, gender equity is an issue with pay, women doing the same work with men, but not getting paid the same. It's not always tied to the effort that you put in. So that's wonderful advice. So, let's get into our time machine for a minute, Karl. Is what advice would you give your younger self if you could go back in time knowing what you know now about money?
That's a great question. I think it would come down to two things that I already mentioned. Like first of all, the fact that money is relative. Because another thing is, when I was freelancing, and I was 13, 14 or so, I would build websites for people, and I would charge them like $500 or so, and I would, in my mind, as a teenager, think that that's so much money. How on earth could they, why would they spend so much money on this thing, right? But then at the same time, like looking back, I could have probably added an extra zero to the end and made almost as many sales, and certainly sort of a lot more overall. And that comes back to kind of just thinking about money relatively. So like, who are you speaking to? How much is this actually worth to them? Because if I can build a business, a website that doesn't currently have a website, and it can increase their sales by $100,000-$200,000 a year, then yeah, they're probably willing to pay more than $500 for that. So that's definitely something that I would tell myself if I could go back. And then I think the other thing is, although I did learn this 10 years ago when I was a teenager, but just thinking about things as assets and liabilities, and really being mindful about that.
Yeah, I love this advice. And, and there's a through line from everything that you've been talking about is to know also to know what something is worth is, when you're starting out, it's hard to know what it's worth. I paid a little more than $500 for the redesign of my website that's coming soon. I wish I'd paid only $500. But I think that's important, is that we oftentimes don't know the value of our assets and liabilities. So not only do you need to think about it in terms of of whether it's an asset or liability, but how much is it actually worth, and what's the net effect, as you were talking about earlier. So what is your number one tip on changing the way we think about money?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question. I think I have lots of tips. If I had to
you can do more than one, but it's got to be your number one.
All right, my number one tip. I think what it comes down to is just being very mindful. Being very mindful of what money is. Like sort of why some people have more, why some people have less. And there, like you very, very rightly pointed out, there is unfortunately a lot of inequality there, and there's a lot of injustice there about why some people have more money than others. And that's the bad thing. But I think the good thing is that everyone, kind of no matter who you are, has the ability to improve their situation, even if it's only a little bit to start with, but bit by bit, everyone has the potential to improve their situation when it comes to money. And then just really kind of, and this is perhaps a bit of a cop-out answer, but, learning a lot of different things about it, really thinking about it, and then, putting those learnings into practice, because it's all good and well, sort of, knowing in theory that things are really only assets or liabilities, and you need to cut your liabilities and increase your assets, right? But it's actually really about putting that into practice. So, I guess the number one tip is like, number one, educate yourself, but the number two, actually take action as well and really put these things into practice.
Yeah, no, I agree. It starts with education, because if you don't know these things, how are you supposed to do anything? Any new skill always involves, some measure of education. Otherwise, you just can't succeed. You don't go and play cards without knowing the card game and the rules. Absolutely. For the card game. And I think people don't think about that sometimes with their money. It's like, well, I'm going to go invest, but then they don't know the rules of investing. And then they wonder why. It's like, I lost a lot of money on that investment. And, and actually it is like poker, because you're playing against a bunch of people who that is their life. they're investment sharks. They know what they're doing. They spent all day thinking about it, planning about it. They have more resources. That's wonderful advice, is to educate yourself and then figure out how to put it into action. And I think figuring that out can be challenging for people too, is how exactly do you put that into action? And that's why, our discussion has been great today, because you've given people some really actionable things to think about. And where I'm trying to go with this podcast too is, those bigger picture things, thinking about things like assets and liabilities, thinking about the value, because those are rules that you can apply across the board, to any facet of the money game. They're not going to give you the final answer, of course, but this is great stuff, and I appreciate your wisdom today. So, Karl, where can people learn more about you and Revolancer, find out what you're up to, get connected?
Yeah, sure. Well, I'd say, if you search my name on Google, you can find me on LinkedIn. That's probably the best place to contact me, or my personal site. And then if you Google Revolancer or go to revolancer.com, and you're interested in freelancing, then you'll be able to get started there.
Fantastic. And it's, people who've been listening or watching this podcast for a while, as always, I'll have links to Karl's websites and social media profiles, so you can get in touch with him, follow him, and see what he's up to. So, Karl, thanks again for joining us today on the Get Ready Money podcast.
It's my pleasure, Tony. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and thank you, everyone, as always, for tuning in to this episode of the Get Ready Money podcast. Please remember to subscribe and change the way you think about money. Until next time.